I knew something was wrong the moment I opened my mailbox. Among the usual stack of bills and advertisements, there was a thick, official-looking envelope. My name was printed in bold letters, but the return address? Homeowners Association. I frowned. That didn't make sense. I had lived in my house for over 3 years, paid my mortgage on time, and had absolutely no dealings with the HOA because I wasn't part of it. That was one of the main reasons I had chosen this house. No arbitrary rules, no petty fines, no one telling me what color my front door should be. But as I ripped open the envelope, my confusion turned into sheer disbelief. Inside was a formal notice demanding immediate payment of overdue HOA fees and rent. Rent. On my own house. I read the letter twice, then a third time, convinced I had misinterpreted something, but the words remained unchanged. According to them, my property was now under their jurisdiction, and I owed them not just a backlog of fees but a monthly rent payment going forward. The letter was littered with legal jargon, veiled threats about liens, and warnings about legal action if I didn't comply. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just a clerical error. This was a shakedown. I placed the letter on the counter, took a deep breath, and tried to piece together how this could even happen. I had done my research when I bought this place. The previous owner had assured me, no HOA. The county records confirmed it. But now, out of nowhere, they were claiming authority over my land? It didn't make sense. I needed answers. I dialed the number listed in the letter, half expecting a robotic voicemail, but to my surprise, someone picked up on the first ring. Homeowners Association, this is Lisa, how may I help you? Her voice was dripping with the kind of forced politeness that immediately put me on edge. I forced myself to stay calm. Yeah, I just got a notice saying I owe HOA fees and rent. But my property isn't part of the HOA. There was a brief pause before she responded, overly cheerful and rehearsed. All properties within our jurisdiction are required to comply with association guidelines, including fee payments. My grip on the phone tightened. That's the thing. My property isn't within your jurisdiction. Another pause. Then a sharp inhale. Sir, our records indicate otherwise. There was something in her tone, a smugness, a certainty, that sent a chill down my spine. They weren't just making a mistake. They were doing this on purpose. I wasn't about to roll over. I went straight to the county office, documents in hand, ready to prove that my land was legally separate from their grasp. The clerk at the records department was helpful, pulling up my property deed within minutes. Yep, your land was never under HOA authority, she confirmed, scrolling through the digital records. Nothing's changed since you bought it. Relief washed over me for a moment, but then the unease crept back in. So how can they suddenly claim it is? She frowned, tapping at her keyboard. They shouldn't be able to. That's illegal. My heart pounded. That's what I had suspected. The HOA wasn't just overreaching, they were pulling something shady. And if they were willing to go this far, I had a feeling they weren't going to back down easily. That I walked out of the county office with a storm brewing inside me. If my property had never been part of the HOA, then what they were trying to do wasn't just overreach, it was fraud. They were banking on the idea that I wouldn't question it, that I would just panic and pay up like so many others probably had before me. But they had picked the wrong homeowner. I wasn't going to let this slide. Clutching my documents, I headed straight home, my mind racing through the possibilities. Were they targeting me specifically, or was this a mass scam they were pulling on multiple properties? How many other homeowners had received similar letters and just blindly accepted it? I needed to get ahead of this before they escalated their tactics. I decided to start with my neighbors. If the HOA was suddenly expanding its supposed jurisdiction, there had to be others dealing with the same nonsense. I knocked on a few doors, but most of the responses were the same. people had either been living there for years under the HOA's rule or weren't aware of any changes. Then I met Mrs. Callahan, an elderly woman 2 streets over, who listened carefully as I explained my situation before nodding with a knowing look. She pulled out a stack of letters from her kitchen drawer, all bearing the HOA's letterhead, all demanding payments she didn't owe. She told me she had lived in her house for nearly 30 years and had never been part of the HOA until suddenly, a few months ago, they started insisting she was. The more I listened, the more it became clear that this wasn't just me, this was a calculated move by the HOA to grab more power and money. I spent the next few days gathering as much information as I could. I filed an official complaint with the county office, submitting copies of my deed, the false HOA notices, and everything I had learned from Mrs. Callahan. I reached out to a local attorney specializing in property disputes, a man named Mark Holloway, who immediately recognized the pattern. He had seen similar cases before, HOAs trying to retroactively absorb properties into their control, using aggressive legal threats to pressure homeowners into submission. He explained that their goal wasn't necessarily to win in court but to make the process so exhausting and expensive that homeowners would rather just comply than fight back. That only fueled my determination. I wasn't going to be another victim. Mark agreed to take my case, but he warned me that the HOA wouldn't back down easily. They had money, legal teams, and years of experience steamrolling over anyone who dared challenge them. I wasn't deterred. If they wanted a fight, I was ready for it. The first real sign of escalation came just 2 days later when I found an unfamiliar SUV parked across the street from my house. At first, I thought it belonged to a visitor or a service worker, but when I walked outside, the driver immediately started his car and pulled away, too fast, too unnatural, like he didn't want to be seen. That night, I noticed another car doing the same thing, idling near my driveway, just far enough to look casual but too suspicious to be a coincidence. I could feel it in my gut, they were watching me. The next morning, I stepped outside to grab my mail and found a bright red violation notice taped to my front door. This time, the demands were even bolder. According to them, I had failed to comply with HOA regulations, and if I didn't resolve the issue immediately, they would place a lien on my property. I gritted my teeth, knowing they were bluffing, but also knowing that if they were willing to fake legal authority, they were willing to make my life a nightmare. I knew I couldn't just sit back and react to their moves, I had to take the fight to them. I went to their next board meeting, despite knowing they would try to shut me out. The moment I walked in, heads turned, whispers rippled through the room, and a few board members exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't expecting me. I took a seat near the back, letting them start their usual business, approving minor rule changes and discussing landscaping fees before I stood up and spoke. I laid out my case, my deed in hand, my voice unwavering as I demanded answers. The board president, a middle-aged man with the slick confidence of someone used to getting his way, barely looked up as he dismissed my concerns with a patronizing smirk, insisting that all properties within their mapped jurisdiction were subject to HOA oversight. I cut him off before he could finish, slapping my documents onto the table. My land was never under their control. County records proved it. They had no legal grounds to demand a single cent from me. Silence filled the room as I watched their confident facade crack, if only slightly. The president, clearly rattled but unwilling to show it, simply said they would look into it before moving to the next agenda item. That was all I needed to confirm what I had suspected. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they were hoping I would back down before exposing them. They had no idea how wrong they were. As I walked out of that board meeting, I knew I had rattled them, but I also knew that I had only scratched the surface of what they were willing to do. The smugness on their faces had cracked just a little, but beneath it was something else, frustration, maybe even anger. They weren't used to being challenged, and they certainly weren't expecting me to come at them with proof that I wasn't under their jurisdiction. That made me dangerous to them. I wasn't just another homeowner who would grumble, pay the fees, and move on. I was a threat to their whole operation, and I had no doubt they would escalate their tactics to make me regret standing up to them. My lawyer had warned me about this exact thing, but even with that warning, I wasn't fully prepared for what came next. The harassment started subtly at first. My mail began arriving late or not at all, bills I had never missed before suddenly showing overdue notices. A city inspector showed up at my door, claiming he had received complaints about an unpermitted structure on my property. I knew immediately this was the HOA's doing, and I wasted no time proving that everything on my land was legal. The inspector, who seemed slightly annoyed at having been sent on a wild goose chase, left without issuing any violations. But that was only the beginning. The next morning, I found a tow truck parked near my driveway, the driver already hooking up to my truck, claiming he had orders to remove an illegally parked vehicle. I barely managed to stop him in time, demanding to see paperwork that, of course, he didn't have. When I pressed him on who had requested the tow, he mumbled something about an anonymous complaint and quickly unhooked my truck before driving off. The message was clear: the HOA wasn't just going to sit back and let me fight them. They were going to make my life miserable until I caved. But instead of scaring me, it only fueled my determination. I knew I couldn't just keep playing defense. I had to strike back. I filed a formal cease and desist letter through my lawyer, demanding that the HOA immediately stop their harassment and retract all false claims about my property. We sent copies of my deed and county records to their legal department, making it crystal clear that I was not under their authority and never had been. But I wasn't naive. I knew they wouldn't just back off. If anything, they would try to push harder, hoping to wear me down. And they did. The next escalation came in the form of a letter taped to my door, bold and aggressive in its wording. According to them, I was now in violation of a community standard for failing to maintain the approved aesthetic of my property. My lawn, they claimed, was too tall. My house color, which had never been an issue before, was suddenly non-compliant with HOA guidelines. And worst of all, they claimed my very ownership of the property was in dispute, implying that they had the right to take legal action to reclaim it. I read the letter twice, my blood boiling. This wasn't just about squeezing money out of me anymore. This was personal. They wanted me gone. I knew I couldn't fight them alone, so I did the one thing they hadn't anticipated: I went public. I took everything I had, every letter, every threat, every legal document proving they were lying, and I put it all online. I posted on local forums, in homeowner rights groups, even in a few legal advice communities where people had dealt with similar cases. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of people reached out, some sharing their own horror stories of HOA corruption, others offering advice on how to fight back. And then, something even bigger happened. A local news station picked up my story. A reporter contacted me, intrigued by the idea of an HOA attempting to charge rent on a house they had no legal claim to. We arranged an interview, and within a week, my face was on the evening news, telling the world exactly what was happening. The story spread fast, picked up by social media, shared by legal experts, and suddenly, the HOA wasn't just dealing with me anymore. They were dealing with public scrutiny, and they didn't like it. Their usual tactics of intimidation weren't going to work when the entire town was watching. But I had underestimated how desperate they were to keep control. I had expected them to retreat, to issue some weak statement about a misunderstanding and try to quietly back down. Instead, they did something far worse. 2 nights after my story aired, I was woken by the sound of sirens and flashing lights outside my house. I stumbled to my front window, groggy and confused, only to see 2 police cars parked in my driveway. My heart pounded as I threw on a jacket and stepped outside, the cold night air biting against my skin. A pair of officers stood by their cruisers, and standing next to them, arms crossed, was none other than the HOA board president. The moment our eyes met, I knew exactly what had happened. He had called the cops on me. The officer closest to me cleared his throat and spoke, his tone neutral but firm. According to the HOA, I was trespassing on my own property. I stared at him, waiting for him to realize how ridiculous that sounded, but he just stood there, waiting for my response. That I stood there, the cold air wrapping around me, but all I could feel was the slow burn of anger rising in my chest. Trespassing. On my own property. The audacity of it was almost laughable, but the presence of two uniformed officers made it clear this was no joke. The board president stood smugly to the side, arms crossed, his expression unreadable but his intent crystal clear. He wanted to escalate. He wanted me gone. And now he was using the police as his personal enforcers. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm, because I knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted me to lose my temper, to react, to say or do something that would justify them forcing me off my land. But I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Instead, I turned to the officer and, without an ounce of hesitation, asked to see the paperwork proving their claim. That was the moment the first crack appeared in their plan. There was none. The officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the board president, who suddenly looked far less confident. I could tell that they had expected me to panic, to either leave voluntarily or argue just enough to justify an arrest. But without any legal basis, they had nothing to stand on. I calmly walked back into my house, retrieved my deed, property records, and the cease and desist letter my lawyer had sent just days earlier. When I handed them over, the older officer skimmed the papers, his brows furrowing. He flipped through the documents again, then turned to the board president, his expression hardening. The shift in power was almost palpable. Whatever the HOA had told the police before they arrived, it clearly wasn't the full truth. The younger officer, who had been standing stiffly by his car, took a step closer, peering over his partner's shoulder. The silence stretched between us, tense and thick, until finally, the older officer handed the papers back to me. He didn't say much, but his tone was different now, less commanding, more neutral. He mumbled something about needing to verify the records before taking further action, but I already knew what that meant. They had come here ready to force me off my own land, and now, they were realizing they had been used. The board president, sensing the change in the situation, quickly jumped in, his voice thick with forced authority, insisting that there were pending legal matters that justified his claim. But it was too late. The police weren't buying it. After a few more strained minutes, the officers left without another word, and I watched as the board president's smug confidence melted away. Without the police backing him up, he was just a man standing in my driveway, grasping at the last shreds of his control. He glared at me, muttered something under his breath, and stormed off to his car, peeling out of my driveway like a sore loser. I didn't move until the taillights disappeared down the road. That was when I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. This was far from over, but now I knew just how far they were willing to go. They weren't just trying to bully me with fines and letters. They were trying to force me out. And that meant I couldn't just keep pushing back, I had to hit them where it hurt. The next morning, I met with my lawyer, laying out everything that had happened the night before. Mark didn't look surprised. He had seen this kind of aggressive HOA behavior before, but even he admitted that calling the police was a bold move. That meant they were getting desperate. And desperation could be used against them. We decided to file an official harassment complaint, documenting every attempt they had made to intimidate me. The fake fines, the tow truck, the city inspector, the unauthorized trespassing, and now the false police report, all of it painted a clear picture of an HOA that was overstepping its bounds in the worst way possible. But I didn't stop there. I reached out to the news reporter who had covered my story earlier, updating them on the latest escalation. The next thing I knew, my case wasn't just a local headline, it was gaining traction statewide. More homeowners came forward, some sharing eerily similar experiences. The pattern became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just an HOA pushing its luck. This was a coordinated effort to seize control over properties they had no legal right to govern. The backlash came fast. Public opinion turned against the HOA overnight. News stations ran segments exposing their tactics, legal experts weighed in, and soon, even local politicians were making statements about the overreach of unchecked homeowners associations. And then came the final blow. The county launched an official investigation into the HOA's practices. Suddenly, it wasn't just me fighting back. It was the law. They demanded records, financial statements, meeting minutes, all the paperwork that would prove whether the HOA had any legal standing to claim my land, or anyone else's. And just like that, the tides shifted. What started as an aggressive power play on their part had turned into a full-scale inquiry into their corruption. I didn't hear from them for a few days after that. No more letters, no more surprise inspections, no more idle cars parked across the street. For the first time in weeks, my house felt like my home again. But I wasn't naive enough to believe it was over. They had pushed too hard to just give up now. And sure enough, just when I thought they might be backing down, I received one final letter, this time, from their lawyers. They were threatening to sue. They were still trying to win. But now, I wasn't just some lone homeowner they could steamroll. Now, they were fighting against the weight of the law, the media, and a public that had turned against them. And they had no idea just how badly they were about to lose. The lawsuit was nothing more than a desperate attempt to regain control, a last-ditch effort to intimidate me into submission. The letter was filled with aggressive legal jargon, accusations of defamation, interference with HOA business, and a demand for financial restitution due to the damages I had caused by publicly exposing their corruption. It was laughable. They were trying to frame themselves as the victims, claiming that my actions had unjustly harmed their reputation. But their real mistake was assuming I would be too afraid to fight back. I immediately forwarded the letter to Mark, who, after reading through it, chuckled in a way that told me this wasn't the first time he had seen such a weak legal bluff. He explained that this type of lawsuit, known as a SLAP, strategic lawsuit against public participation, was a common scare tactic used by organizations trying to silence people who spoke out against them. But in reality, they had no legal grounds to sue me. If anything, their actions only strengthened my case against them. With the media coverage, public scrutiny, and now a formal county investigation underway, their position was crumbling. And they knew it. Instead of backing down, I doubled my efforts. Mark filed an official counterclaim against the HOA, not only seeking damages for harassment but also demanding a full legal review of their authority over my property. The county's legal team got involved, their investigators already uncovering irregularities in how the HOA had been operating. Financial discrepancies, unlawful property claims, and cases of homeowners being forced to pay fees they never owed were surfacing one after another. What had started as my personal battle was now turning into a much larger scandal. The HOA board was starting to fracture, with some members suddenly resigning, distancing themselves from the mess before they could be held accountable. And then, the real turning point came, a whistleblower. One of the former HOA board members reached out to the media with damning evidence. Internal emails, documents, and meeting notes that confirmed everything I had suspected from the beginning. The HOA had been targeting properties that legally weren't under their jurisdiction, forging documents to make it appear as if those properties had always been part of the association. Their plan was simple: overwhelm homeowners with legal threats, assume most wouldn't fight back, and collect as many fraudulent payments as possible before anyone caught on. But now, with everything out in the open, they weren't just dealing with angry homeowners anymore. They were dealing with fraud charges. The fallout was immediate. The county froze all HOA financial transactions, pending further investigation. The lawsuit they had filed against me was dismissed before it could even make it to a courtroom. Their own legal team started backing away, likely realizing they were representing an organization that wouldn't survive the legal consequences of their actions. And then, in the final, most satisfying moment of it all, the HOA president, the same man who had smugly called the police on me weeks earlier, was removed from his position. Not by legal force, not by county intervention, but by the very homeowners he had once ruled over. In a chaotic emergency meeting, residents voted overwhelmingly to dissolve the existing board, stripping them of their power in one swift move. The president, red-faced and shouting, stormed out of the meeting as his control slipped through his fingers. With the corrupt board gone, the new leadership took over with a completely different tone. Their first order of business was issuing official apologies to every homeowner who had been wrongly targeted. Their second was a complete audit of the HOA's finances, which quickly exposed years of mismanagement and misappropriated funds. Homeowners who had paid illegitimate fees were refunded, and legal measures were taken against those responsible. But the best part? My property was officially removed from any further disputes. No more letters, no more fines, no more false claims. I had won. For the first time in months, I felt at peace as I stood on my front porch, looking out at the land that was, and always had been, mine. The battle had been exhausting, but it had been worth every second. I hadn't just fought for myself, I had fought for every homeowner who had ever been bullied by a power-hungry HOA. And in the end, justice had prevailed. The irony of it all was that after spending so much time resisting the HOA's control, I was now helping shape what would replace it. The new leadership, recognizing my efforts, asked for my input on rebuilding the association in a way that actually served the community instead of exploiting it. At first, I wanted nothing to do with it, but after seeing how things were shifting, I realized something. This wasn't just about tearing down corruption. It was about ensuring that it never happened again. So I agreed, not as a board member, not as an enforcer of rules, but as a voice of reason, a reminder that power should never go unchecked. Months later, as I attended the first real community meeting under the new leadership, I looked around and saw neighbors talking, sharing ideas, actually working together instead of living in fear of some overreaching authority. The HOA wasn't just an entity anymore. It was a community. And as much as I had fought against it, I realized that was all I had ever wanted. A home that was truly mine. A neighborhood that wasn't ruled by control but by cooperation. And most importantly, proof that when you stand your ground against corruption, you can win. With the battle behind me and the corrupt HOA dismantled, life settled into a kind of peace I hadn't felt in months. The threats, the surveillance, the intimidation, gone. The new board had taken over, and while I kept my distance from their internal politics, I knew that the worst was over. Homeowners who had been wrongfully charged were getting their refunds, the fraudulent documents were being reviewed for legal consequences, and the former board members were now the ones scrambling for cover. But even with the victory, a part of me remained restless. Winning wasn't just about getting them off my back. It was about making sure something like this never happened again. I had spent so much time fighting against an unfair system that I hadn't really considered what came next. It wasn't long before I received another letter in the mail, but this time, it wasn't a demand. It was an invitation. The new HOA board, now led by people who had fought alongside me, wanted me to attend a community forum to help discuss how to prevent abuse of power in the future. At first, I considered throwing the letter away. After everything I had been through, the idea of voluntarily stepping back into an HOA meeting felt like walking into the lion's den. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that ignoring it would mean walking away from an opportunity to make sure no one else had to go through what I did. I had spent months proving that standing up for yourself worked. Maybe now was the time to prove that rebuilding something the right way was just as important as tearing down what was broken. When I arrived at the meeting, I expected the usual tension, the side glances, the remnants of old grudges. Instead, I was met with nods of recognition, a few quiet thank yous from neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up. The new board was already different. Instead of a row of self-important figures sitting above the crowd, the new leadership sat among the homeowners, listening instead of dictating. The conversation wasn't about enforcement. It was about protection. Homeowners who had once been ignored now had a voice, and that meant something. People shared their frustrations, their experiences, their ideas on how to ensure the HOA served the residents instead of exploiting them. It was the kind of conversation that should have happened years ago. The discussion turned to legal safeguards, to making sure no future board could ever attempt the kind of fraud and manipulation the previous one had. It wasn't about whether or not an HOA should exist. It was about what kind of HOA should exist. One with clear boundaries, limited authority, and absolute transparency. I sat through the discussions, speaking only when necessary, making sure my experience served as a reminder of why rules weren't enough, why there had to be accountability. The more I listened, the more I realized something strange. After months of feeling like an outsider in my own neighborhood, I had finally become a part of it. Not because I had been forced into some ridiculous system, but because I had fought for something better. In the weeks that followed, the changes became real. The HOA bylaws were rewritten from the ground up, this time with the entire community involved. Restrictions were scaled back, unnecessary fees were eliminated, and homeowners were given more power to challenge any future overreach. The new board set up an independent review system to prevent the kind of unchecked authority that had once ruled over us. And for the first time, it felt like the HOA was actually serving its purpose, to maintain shared spaces, to organize events, to help rather than control. The absurd fines, the intimidation tactics, the senseless bureaucracy, it was all gone. One afternoon, as I was working on my front porch, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Neighbors talking to each other, not just in passing but in real conversation. Kids playing freely, families setting up small gatherings in their yards without fear of some arbitrary rule being broken. The neighborhood wasn't just a collection of houses anymore. It was finally a community. And as much as I had fought to keep myself separate from the HOA, I had played a part in making that happen. It would have been easy to walk away, to enjoy my victory in isolation, but I had learned something through all of this. Fighting against corruption was important, but what came after mattered just as much. If you only destroy without rebuilding, you leave behind nothing but a vacuum for the next problem to take hold. I had fought my battle and won, but now, I had helped create something stronger in its place. Not because I had wanted to, but because it was the right thing to do. Months later, as I walked through the neighborhood, I barely recognized it from the place I had first moved into. Not because of the houses or the streets, but because of the people. They weren't afraid anymore. The HOA was no longer an oppressive force looming over them. It was just a part of the neighborhood, doing what it was meant to do and nothing more. As I reached my house, I looked out over my land, the same land they had once tried to claim as their own, and for the first time, I felt completely at peace. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic showdown, no need for another battle. The war was over. And this time, I wasn't just fighting to be left alone. I was standing in a home and a community that I had helped make better. And that was a victory worth more than any lawsuit, more than any headline, more than any single battle. Because I had proven that no matter how much power they think they have, no matter how hard they try to control you, if you stand your ground, you can take it back. The months passed, and for the first time in a long time, life felt normal. I had spent so much time preparing for the next attack, the next scheme, the next desperate attempt from the HOA to control what wasn't theirs, that it took me a while to adjust to the quiet. But quiet didn't mean nothing was happening. The changes I had fought for were taking root, and one by one, the scars left by the old HOA were healing. The board was no longer a secretive panel of power-hungry enforcers, it was now made up of actual homeowners, people who had been through the same frustrations I had. People who had been afraid to speak up before, now finally having a say. Meetings were open, transparent, and free of the condescending lectures that once defined them. Rules were simplified, restrictions loosened, and the homeowners were given the ability to challenge anything they felt was unfair. The new leadership didn't just promise to be different. They proved it with action. Despite all of this, I still kept my guard up. I had seen firsthand how quickly things could turn. Power, even when placed in the right hands, had a way of creeping back to the wrong ones. But this time, something was different. The homeowners were no longer passive. They had seen what happened when they allowed others to rule over them unchecked. They had seen the consequences of not questioning, of not pushing back, of assuming that just because someone was in charge, they had their best interests at heart. That wasn't going to happen again. The fear that had kept them silent was gone, replaced by something stronger, awareness. The board wasn't untouchable anymore. They were accountable to the people they served, and they knew it. As much as I had fought to stay detached from the HOA, I found myself more involved than I had ever expected. Not because I had to be, but because I wanted to make sure what we had built didn't crumble. I attended meetings, not as a board member but as a homeowner who wanted to keep the balance we had fought so hard for. The same people who once avoided eye contact with me now sought me out for advice, and as much as I had resisted the idea of being part of this community, I realized that I had already become one of its most vocal members. It was a strange shift. I had spent so much time fighting to be free of the HOA, and now I was one of the voices shaping what it had become. Then, one day, I got a call from Mark. The county investigation had wrapped up, and the findings were worse than we had expected. Not only had the old HOA board committed fraud, but they had also been siphoning money from homeowners for years, funneling funds into personal accounts under the guise of maintenance costs that never existed. They had extorted thousands of dollars from people who had trusted them, and now, the law was finally catching up. Several of the former board members were facing criminal charges, and the former president, the man who had called the police on me, the man who had stood in my driveway and tried to take my home, was at the center of it all. The final blow had landed. He wasn't just out of power, he was facing real consequences. When I heard the news, I expected to feel a sense of triumph, a final victory over everything they had put me through. But instead, I felt something else, closure. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving a point anymore. It was about knowing that, in the end, they had lost. Not just in the public eye, not just in reputation, but in the one way that mattered the most. The same system they had used to control others had turned against them. They had built their power on fear, on deceit, on intimidation. And in the end, all of it had collapsed beneath the weight of their own corruption. With the last remnants of the old HOA gone, the neighborhood finally became what it was always meant to be. It wasn't perfect, no community ever is, but it was fair. People had a say in how things were run. There were no secret meetings, no unexplained fees, no threats disguised as rules. Just homeowners, living their lives without the constant fear of stepping out of line. It was the kind of place I had hoped for when I first bought my house, and now, it was real. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, I thought about everything that had happened. The fights, the stress, the long nights wondering if I was making a mistake by pushing back. It had all led to this. A home that was truly mine. A community that had learned the value of standing up for itself. And a reminder that power only exists where people allow it to. If no one questions authority, it grows unchecked. But if you challenge it, if you refuse to back down, if you demand accountability, then even the strongest, most arrogant systems can fall. As I leaned back in my chair, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood, I realized something. I had spent so much time preparing for the next fight, the next battle, the next attack. But for the first time, I didn't need to. The fight was over. And this time, I had truly won.